Yeah.
All right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Farzaneh Derakhshan, who is visiting us from CMU, where she has a position as a postdoctoral researcher working with Stephanie Balzer. For that, she did her PhD also at CMU with Frank Penny. And I won't spend more time take away from you, except to just briefly let people know you're here actually for today and tomorrow visiting and have time to meet with people. I think some of us can go out to lunch after this meeting and find other times to get together too. Take it away.
Thank you for coming to my talk. It's a talk about recursive session logical relations for information flow control, and I will go through all of these definitions throughout the talk. So a little bit about myself. I'm working on verifying safety and security of software programs in general, and my thesis was on proving productivity of session type recursive processes by mapping them into some infinitary linear logic. And this talk is based on Lee's paper that we had in 21 for like title session logical relations for non-interference, which was Stephanie Balzer and Joe, and an extension of it that is available on archive, and we're preparing to submit it. It's called recursive session logical relations that we extended the previous work for recursive types. So let's just start with session types. So session types are a paradigm for message passing concurrency. And by the way, please interrupt me if there is any questions or if something is not clear. So session types are a paradigm for message passing concurrency. Their building blocks are processes, and processes are connected to each other via channels. And for each channel, we associate a protocol that is called the session type of that channel. And that protocol enforces like the order of the messages that is transferred along that channel. So for example, if I associate a protocol that sends an integer and receives an acknowledgement, the process sends an integer first and then receives or waits to receive an acknowledgement from the partner. Okay, and then if we put all of these processes together and draw all of their connections, we get a configuration that is a graph. So in this talk, I want to talk about a specific form of session type processes, in which, again, we have processes, but now any two processes are connected by exactly one channel. So we call this channel a binary channel because it has exactly two endpoints. Okay? And it's a terminology to call this channel a resource. The child provides that resource, and the parent uses that resource. And we are in a setting, we call it intuitionistic setting, because the whole thing is based on an intuitionistic linear logic. But the takeaway is that in this setting, the configuration is always a rooted tree, because each process can only offer exactly one channel. It cannot offer more than that. So we have this rooted tree, and in this rooted tree, processes can talk to each other with sending and receiving messages. And to each channel, we associate a protocol. So the protocols, I just give you like a rough introduction to them. They can be sending or receiving labels of these like ampersand and plus form. They can be higher order protocols, along which we can send or receive channels, and they can be terminating, like termination. Okay, so let's look at these protocols. I will give you like more example later through the talk, but for now, let's look at this like protocols and how they specify the communication. So we first start with the label communication. There are two different choices here. In one, the parent chooses which label it wants to send to the child. So the parent chooses one label along all of the labels that are specified in the side and send it to the children, and the children receives it, the child receives it. And in the other one, the child chooses which label to send. The child chooses, for example, here label LK, and sends it to the parent. And as you can see, with each communication, the protocol changes accordingly. So these protocols are dynamic. Okay. And then I told you about higher order channels. How do they work? For example, so we have Lolly and Tensor. In Lolly, the parent sends the whole subtree to the child. So it transfers one channel along the other. And in Tensor, the child sends the whole subtree to the parent. Again, as you can see, the protocol changes after the communication. And finally, we have termination, that the child sends close to the parent. It wants to close this communication, and the communication, like the channel is gone. And of course, the child can only do it if itself is a leaf. There shouldn't be anything below that. Okay, so if it is your first exposure to the session type, it might seem a lot, but I want you to have this mental image that I have, and will help you to understand like the rest of the talk. And the mental image is to think about each channel as some kind of memory cell with exactly two references to it. Okay, so but these two, so from the child and the parent. So the important thing is that these two references have different capabilities, and the capabilities are dual. One of them, the child can send, the parent can receive, or in like the negative protocol, the child can receive, the parent can send. And because we are in the rooted tree, it has this very nice feature that there is no deadlock, and all of processes are faithful to their protocols, which means that we have a safe flow of information throughout the configuration. So in the talk, I now want to introduce secure flow of information, and I will explain what this secure information flow means, but that is like the topic of this talk, secure flow of information along this, inside this like rooted tree configuration. Okay, so let's start with a running example. Here we have a banking example. We have a process bank. We have Alice, we have Bob that are connected to process bank with the channels Y and Y prime, and they're I call their protocols customer. And we have for each of the customers, we have an account. Here, the yellow account is for Alice, the gray account is for Bob. And each account is managed by an individualized authorization process. So the responsibility of the authorization process is to lock the account. And if the customer can provide the correct key, it will give the account to the customer. And if not, it doesn't provide the account to the customer. Okay, so here are the definition of the protocols. I will walk you through all of these definitions. And here are the definitions of the processes, bank, Alice, and Alice authorization. So don't worry about the definitions right now. Okay, so let's look at like an example of how this configuration computes. And let's first focus on the communication between bank and Alice. So as you can see, the protocol between bank and Alice is a higher order protocol, meaning that bank sends the whole subtree of the customer account to Alice, and Alice receives it. Again, the takeaway from this slide would be bank sends, Alice receives, and there is like the whole subtree changes. The whole subtree is transferred, so the like the structure of the tree is changed after this communication. And similarly, bank can send the account subtree to Bob. And now we want to focus on the communication between Alice and its authorization process. So here the type is the ampersand, and ampersand gives the responsibility of choosing the label to Alice. And there are two possible labels, either choosing the yellow key or the blue key. Alice chooses the yellow key, which turns out to be the correct key. So Alice sends the correct key by this thing, and then Alice authorization receives the yellow key with this case, and they continue accordingly. Now, Alice authorization decides that, okay, this yellow key was the correct key. I will send the success label back to Alice. So it sends the success label to Alice. The protocols are now changed, and Alice authorization sends the whole subtree of the account back to Alice. And now Alice can communicate with its account, with her account as she wants. Okay, so far it looks like a secure communication, right?
Sorry, can I ask a question? How did the bank know which account to send to which person?
Exactly. So do you mean
I mean, Alice got sent the yellow one and happened to have the yellow key, so everything worked out great, but nothing in her message, the server just says, here's off.
exactly? So that was defined in the process definition to send X to Y, but it will send X prime to Y. Right?
Yeah.
And that was a direct flow that would also be an insecure flow, but it's a direct flow because we exactly know you're sending the wrong key to someone that is not authorized. So this kind of flow is exactly something that we are going to prohibit.
I see, but with that information flow, we're just gonna say, oh, assume that they have some way of identifying who is who.
Exactly. So that is the responsibility of the programmer to make sure that it's sending the correct account to the correct customer. Right. That was a great question. Okay, I don't know how to go without skipping animations. Okay. So that was an example of a direct flow. Here, I want to give you a more subtle flow of information, which is an indirect flow, in which it's just a subtle change to the previous example that I put a sneaky authorization instead of this the authorization process that we have. Okay, so the first steps are the same. Alice sends the yellow key to the sneaky authorization, and a sneaky authorization knows that it's a successful, it will be a successful, authentication. But before sending the success to Alice, it will send the success label to the attacker that is attached to it. So now it will notify the attacker that Alice had a successful authentication, which is kind of a leak, right? And it's like you may say, oh, it's a benign thing because we are okay if someone knows that we had a successful authentication, but it could be very worse. The sneak authorization could send the exact key to the attacker. Okay, so to be clear why this is like a link, let's say that Alice now is a different process. It decides to send the blue key instead of the yellow key. And Alice authorization process knows that it's an incorrect key, so it notifies again the attacker that the authentication was failed. Okay. So here you can see that with this sneaky authorization process, we have a leak from the information that is supposed to be known only by Alice to an attacker. And the responsible entity for this leak is the sneaky authorization process. So in order to be able to formalize this kind of leak, we follow the standard way of introducing a security lattice, and meaning that we define a label for each secrecy level in our configuration. So here, for example, we have bank, we have Alice and Bob that are lower than bank, they can know more, they can know less. And at the very bottom, we have guest. And the point is we associate these secrecy levels to the channels, right? So to each channel, I associate a secrecy level. For example, the channel that is operated by bank is of secrecy band, the channel offered by Alice, secrecy Alice, the channel offered by Bob, secrecy Bob, the channel offered by the sneak authorization, secrecy Alice, because it's Alice's authorization process. The channel offered by the attacker offers a secrecy guess, because it cannot know about Alice, either Alice or Bob. And finally, Alice's account is Alice, and we have the same labels on the right-hand side too. So the goal of our work is to first give a type system that limit this kind of indirect flows and the direct flow that sends, for example, secrecy Alice authorization process to Bob. So we want to have a type system that statically rule out this kind of information leaks. And in particular, we want that this type system rejects a sneak authorization process, right? And so to make sure that we want to prove some kind of adequacy theorems showing that our information flow control type system does the thing that we want it to do, we prove a property called non-interference, which means that we want to prove two programs are equivalent, like a program is equivalent to itself up to the secrecy of any observer. So for example, here, we want to make sure that Alice, a sneaky authorization for Alice is not equivalent to itself up to the secrecy of guess, right? So if we were in a pure functional setting, proving equivalence was like run the program, get the end value, look at the end value, and if the two end values are the same up to the secrecy level of the observer, then they are equivalent. But we are in as you can see, in a process message passing setting in which there is no end value. So we need a form of equality that is defined using bisimulation as a standard notion for proving behavioral equality for processes. I will talk about this briefly at the end of the talk. So we need to somehow close this gap. And we are very lucky because we have types, we have session types, and we can use logical relations and index them by our session types. And I will go through what is the definition of this logical relation in the talk. Okay, so one nice property about having a logical relation is we prove that some program is well typed with our type system. Now we prove that this program is related to itself with our logical relation. We have a theorem that shows that if a program is related to itself by a logical relation, it's bisimilar to itself. So we have non-interference. But the nice property about logical relation is we can even okay, so our type system will for sure reject some of the good, programs because it's doing something statically and it's not complete and it's decidable. But if you can prove that even if something is not well typed, it is in the logical relation, then you can say that it has the non-interference property. So it's something that they call it semantic typing. Even if it's not statically typed, if it is in the logical relation with some other measures, you can prove this in the logical relation, then it's bisimilar to itself. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, I will first talk about the ideas of our typing system. Then I will talk about the recursive or logical relation. I'll show you the basic schema. I'll show you what are the challenges that are enforced by recursion. And then I prove that, I show that the proof of bisimulation. And finally, I conclude by talking about the future work that we can do. Okay, so let's just start with the typing judgments. And this is like a standard typing judgment for session types, for session type processes. We have a process, it offers a unique channel X, and it uses this like channels in delta as its resources. Okay, so if you're familiar with like typing judgments in a pure functional setting, usually the thing on the right is the value that the function evaluates to. Okay, so here it's very different, and I want you to have this again, this mental image that this A is not the final value. It's a channel that is very similar to the channels in delta. The only difference is P has a different capability with that channel. It has the capability of the child with that channel. So it has to, when it comes to communication, it has to do some kind of dual thing with the channel on the right. So that is the important takeaway from this slide, basically.
So that's saying A is the type from the point of view of the client,
Exactly.
and then the child's behavior will be equal to that.
Exactly. So the A is the type that they share, but the capability of P is different from the capability of the client. Exactly. Yeah.
So I was just saying A is a session type. Right?
Exactly. A is a session type. Like B1, B2, and Bn, they're all session type.
But you're not using two different types that are complementary to the channel, you're using a single type.
Exactly. There is a single type, but based on whether you are the client or the provider of that type, you do dual things. If one sends, the other one receives. So your understanding of the type is different from your child's understanding of the type. They're dual, right? So, for example, if there is a cell, if you think of it as a cell, if I can write it on it, I know that the other guy should read on it. It wouldn't be the case that we both want to write on it, or we both want to read on it. Okay, so now for the secrecy levels, we annotate our the typing judgment with some possible words. And we already talked about the security lattice. It's a standard lattice that we added to the like the judgment. It's that bank, Alice, Bob, yes, in the example. And this secrecy level that we attach to channels, again, we talked about it. But as you can see here, I called it a maximal secrecy for a reason. And the reason is because we are in a like in a tree structure, you can interpret the secrecy of the channel as the maximal secrecy that the process can obtain, right? So the interpretation of D is the level of secret information that process is licensed to obtain. So you somehow interpret it with the unique channel, unique process that offers it. Okay, and there is a tree invariant, which is very important in the proofs, and it has a very nice reason behind it. I can explain it later if someone is interested in it. The tree invariant says that the child nodes can only have the secrecy of at most as high as the parent node. So here, D1, D2, Dn, all of them are less than or equal to D. Basically, the child node cannot know more than its parent. And I didn't talk about this running secrecy. The running secrecy is a dynamic secrecy. It's the level of secret information the process has obtained so far. So when we do the communication, this running secrecy changes over time. As you gather more information, your running secrecy goes higher. And that is where the checks come true. If you receive something from a channel of some max secrecy, you have to increase your running secrecy to be at least of that max secrecy. And if you want to send, you have to make sure that the process has some license at least higher, at least equal or higher than your running secrecy. So in this way, you can ensure that processes like a sneak authorization are not type checked.
And this can't exceed the maximal secrecy that we're associated with, the running secrecy.
What was the question again?
So this running secrecy attached to P, that can't exceed the maximum.
Exactly, no, that is another tree invariant that I didn't put here, but exactly, C is always less than or equal to D. So the maximal secrecy is really the maximum of everything that is connected or attached to this process.
And then you've used sort of very like runtime language to describe this, but do you actually track these labels at runtime, or is this entirely a static phenomenon on top of a more conventional concurrent system?
So that is a good question. We track them like statically but for the proof, we also track them on the runtime so that we can prove that if something has higher running secrecy cannot stand this and this, so we need them in the proof.
Mhm.
But in the runtime, they're not really that important. We can also run it without these,
So you could have a runtime that didn't track this, but you
exactly.
wouldn't be able to prove, you wouldn't have the right invariant to prove, but like the property would hold, you wouldn't be able to show.
Exactly. If you check it statically, you know that in runtime they would hold.
Could you show where the sneak authorization fails this process?
Oh, sure. I haven't. I have to switch to Google slide to show that to you, but. Can I show that at the end of?
Yeah,
Google,
sure,
or
sure, that's fine.
If it doesn't block you, because I have to switch.
No, that's
between-
fine. I'll try and remember.
Um.
A
Okay, so
question on that slide, actually, because the C and D seem to be levels of the ladders of labels.
right,
So why the term possible worlds? You call them possible worlds.
because when we like do this, when we write the judgment, the lattice can be anything arbitrary. So this D is kind of some modality or some possibility that X has. So does that answer your question? Or
Really, because I thought D was meant to be like a label, so it's a constant, some element of the lattice, is that right?
okay, so if you're in the recursive type, this D is not necessarily a label. It can be a variable that has some constraint on. We have some constraint on it on the security layers. If you're in the terminating setting, it's a constant that we associate to X, but in the recursive setting, we have all of these are polymorphic, and X, the maximal secrecy, the running secrecy, all of them can be variables. And we somehow solve this variable when we do some kind of ML polymorphic thing.
I'm not sure I see the connection with possible worlds, maybe it will show up in the logical relation.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so now let's look at this. Let's start with the basic schema of logical relation. But before going to that, we want to establish like some pattern rule that I explained here. So I explained this duality between send and receives. Right here, we want to use this duality to define like an equivalence between two configuration of processes. Okay. So how does this equivalence is defined? Let's say that we have these two open configurations, open programs, and by open I mean that there are a snapshot of some part of the whole configuration. Okay, and here these are like the external channels, and they can be substituted with any tree or subtree as we want. But now we want to show that these two snapshots that we have are equivalent to each other. So if there is an incoming message coming in, we have no idea whether they are equivalent or not, because they're coming from outside. The only thing that we can do is to assume that they're related up to the secrecy level of the observer. And we push them inside, and then we can run the program internally, and it produces some outgoing messages for us. So if these two programs are really equivalent, we know that M2 and N2, we should be able to assert that M2 and N2 are related to each other. And we can now send them out. And similarly, we should be able to assert that M3 and N3 . Okay, so this definition is one step away from the bisimulation that we wanted. The reason that I say it's one step away is because, first of all, in the bisimulation, we have the whole closed tree, and there is no such thing as assume. We should be able to assert that the receiving messages are the same, the sending messages are the same. But this is still something. So we are going to work with this do between assume and assert. Okay, so let's to define the basic scheme of the logical relation. Let's start with our sneaky authorization process. And the sneaky authorization process is has connections with X of secrecy Alice, W of secrecy guess, and U of secrecy Alice. So the idea is that we say we want to show that this process is equivalent to itself, and substitute the the other parts of the tree that are missing as you want. So for example, here in the first instance, I substituted it with a process Alice that provided the correct key. And in the second instance, I substituted it with Alice that provided the incorrect key, the wrong key. And let's see how they work with each other. So now there are incoming messages from Alice, right? The yellow and blue key. And so I want to assume that they are equivalent up to the observer level, which is guess. And this assumption is correct because even though the messages are different, they are sent along a channel that is not observable. They're sent along Alice. So the assumption is correct. I bring them in. Now I run the program internally, and I can assert that I should be able to assert that success along the guess is equivalent to success fail along the guess, but this is not correct, right? So this assertion fails, and this is good, which means we are on the right track. We couldn't show that these two programs are equivalent to each other. Okay, so you may ask why do we need to consider this, this channel Alice of secrecy Alice when I told you that every message that is sent along it is not observable to guess. So why do we need to even consider incoming messages from that? And this question is valid. We don't need to consider that. So to make our life easier, I expand this program, like our triangle, to include all of the secret channels, like external channels that are not observable to guess. So I expanded such that the only things on the interface that we have are observable to the observer level. And now we have in the next slides, I have this terminology that I call these D1 and D2, the big things that only have observable interface. And the substitutions on the bottom, I call them C1 and C2. And the interface is always observable. It's of secrecy guess. And it's this channel W, and it's on the left. On the right, I don't have anything, right? So it's empty on the right. So let's look at a generalization of this program. We have D1 and D2 that they can be any programs. and they can have multiple observable channels on the interface. We call them delta. And they can have one or non observable interface on the right, which is K. And I showed you C1 and C2 as the substitutions on the bottom. We also have F1 and F2 are substitutions on the top. And delta K is like the interface. Now this E is like the base of our logical relation. If you're familiar with logical relation, they call it term interpretation usually. And we saw something similar to it already. We said that before like receiving or sending messages, the incoming or outgoing messages, we should step each of these subconfigurations internally until there are some outgoing or incoming messages already. So the interpretation just says do all of the like internal things that you can do. And then we check that the resulting things are in the value relation, and I will talk about this value interpretation shortly, but we already saw something similar to that earlier. Okay, so if we are in the terminating phase, we can easily say step these two until no other internal steps are available, right? So, and it's always a unique state that we can reach to, because if you do everything and instead of like we have confluence, so you always get to the same structure after you run it. Okay, so what about the value interpretation? We have, let's say that we have outgoing messages from D1.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to back up. I got really confused. How can you have confluence if there's choice?
It's not a non-deterministic choice. So,
So somebody somewhere, they're making the choice deterministically, just they might be external to you.
exactly.
I understand.
Yeah, and this is, yeah, exactly. So if you run D1 and D2 internally, there is no, you know that if you run D1 internally, it will always get to the end
I
result.
understand. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so right. So now let's say that we have outgoing messages, and we want to say that they're in the value interpretation. Well, we saw that earlier. If they're outgoing messages, assert that they are the same messages, and then push them inside. And I write equal, but if they're higher order channels, they should be related with some other value interpretation. But for now, let's say that they're just labels and they're equal. And again, if we are in the terminating case, there is no recursive types or anything. So we always know that this AK is less than or equal to the type before. So with each communication, a measure goes down, the types go down. So even though we have this recursive back and forth, we have a well-founded definition, right? Okay. And then with the incoming messages, it's again the same. We push them in, but before that, we assume that the messages that are coming in are the same. Again, without recursion, it's a well-founded thing. So in summary, we have a term interpretation. We step each configuration internally until there are some messages ready. And then we transfer them by asserting or assuming that they're equal. And we transfer them into like, we do this like out external exchanges within the value interpretation. Now, let's briefly look at the challenges that we face with recursion. The first challenge is, of course, non-termination. And because I told you that run it until you exhaust everything that can be done internally, cannot be done if we have recursion. So if you are in the term interpretation, the question is, how long do you want to set it, right? And the other challenge is concurrency or non-determinism. Let's say that there are multiple messages ready. Which one of these messages do you want to choose to bring in? If this is an terminating scenario, you can choose any of them. And then because it's terminating, you will get to the next one later, right? Because there are only finally messages available. But if there's a non-terminating case, then this concurrency comes in, because which one do you really want to choose. And if you keep, for example, choosing these two messages here to assert, then forever you will ignore the messages down here. So you will never assert that these two are the same. So that is why we need, in the non-terminating case, we need some kind of focus channel. So we associate this focus channel to our value interpretation, and we say that if we focus on y, you can only assert bring like messages being the same along y, and I show you how this focus channel works in the term interpretation later. And the last challenge is well-foundedness, of course, because if you have recursive types, there is no guarantee that delta prime k is less than or equal to delta k. We do all of this like recursive types between term and value interpretation, and no measure goes down because the types can like get bigger. So for that, we need some kind of index, and this index, I call it observation index. And again, I explain why we call it observation index, but with each external communication, we make this index with go one level down. Okay, so let's look at the term interpretation once more. Okay, so in the term interpretation, previously I told you to in the terminating case run D1 and D2 internally until there is no internal steps available. I told you that this is not possible here. So the solution is to say run D1 until as long as you want. I don't care. As long as you want, run D1 and collect the message, the channels that have some outgoing messages in there. And for any like run of D1, there should be a run of D2 that produces the exact same channels with the same outgoing messages. And this gives us some progress sensitive non-interference, but insists that they are like they go hand by hand. And for the incoming messages, I don't care that you can again run them internally. I don't care what you produce. They can be different from each other because I only would assume that they are the same. And then the focus channel comes in here. It says that for every channel that is ready, that has a message ready, focus on that channel and assert that the messages along them are equivalent in both D1 and D2. And for the incoming messages, it says, I will only assume the messages that are ready along both like runs are the same. And it will bring them in. Okay, so the interesting part is this observation index. This observation index says like what are the number of observations that we do along we are checking along this interface. Okay, so for example, if I have n+1, it means that I check that D1 and D2 are related. I do this assert and assume only for n+1 times. After n+1 times, I give you no guarantee that they're equivalent to each other. And so in the value interpretation, with any assert and any assume, we know that one less observation is remaining, so we decrement that. And then finally, with this relation, with this logical relation, we can prove an extensional logical equivalence, meaning that if we have D1 and D2 that are equal to each other, we define D1 and D2 to be equal to each other. If they first of all have the same interface, they should agree on the interface. And we can prove that for every M, so for any observation index that you want, for any way that you want to close that open tree, they should be related in this E relation. And we of course prove that this equality is really an equality, it's reflexive, transitive, and symmetric. And finally, this is our adequacy theorem that said if two programs are we can prove that they're equivalent to them to each other, then if we put them in the same context, we close them with the same context, then they are really bisimilar to each other. Meaning that if the two messages are coming in, we can assert that these two messages are the same or equivalent. And of course, if there are messages outgoing, we can assert that the messages are related. So this is a form of bisimulation that we prove, except that is like a stratified bisimulation. I don't want to go into this, like the definition of stratified bisimulation. It's just like, it has the same observation index that we had on our logical relation. And so this observation index is very different from the step index that we have in the functional setting. If you're interested in that, I can explain more, but yeah, so that was about the logical relation. And so in conclusion, we have introduced this IFC type system for binary session types, and we defined the first logical relation for recursive linear session types. I said at first, and like the main challenge was coming up with the, like what to choose as an index to make it well-founded, so that we can prove like those transitivity, reflexivity, and symmetry. And then we prove that it's an equivalence, in particular non-interference reflexivity, and we have an adequacy theorem. And in future, so there's an ongoing work about the classification. We want to get a proper sensitive file system for the classification, and we want to implement our system and also look at sharing. So thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Can you just go back 2 slides? Yeah, here, oh, sorry. So this is for you're putting B1 and B2 in the same context, right? Which is why you can assert those 2 messages very close.
Exactly. And so it's not obvious that if you put them in the same context, they will send you the same message. It's a result of reflexivity that F and F are related to each other, and they can assert that they're sending you the same message. So you think it's obvious that, okay, so if I the same program, they will send me the same messages, but it's not really that obvious. It's the whole point of proving reflexivity, right? So.
And does this result still hold if it's not the same context, but equivalent?
Exactly. Yeah. So to prove this theorem, we actually need to generalize it, saying that if you put them in an equivalent context, then yeah.
When you say reflexivity, are you saying the relation is reflexive, or you're saying the typable terms are related to themselves?
I mean that that's a good question. So I mean that the typable terms are related to themselves. But for any typable term, they are related to themselves.
Well, so it's reflexive on the typable terms.
Exactly. Yeah.
So and sort of the usual thing is that it's going to be transitive and symmetric, and to be secure means exactly that it is self-related.
Exactly.
So it's not reflexive in general. The relation is reflexive.
It's reflexive for semantically well-typed things. There's syntactically ill-typed things that will be self-related.
Right. So the whole theorem is basically that for well-typed things, they relate to themselves.
Yes.
But the underlying relation usually wouldn't be reflexive.
Right, an insecure program is not related to itself.
The insecure program is not related to itself.
So
Exactly.
it's not a reflexive relation. It's reflexive on the right things.
Reflexive on the right. So what we want to prove is that if something is syntactically well-typed, it is reflexive. It has this reflexivity property, but it's not that the program. It's not that the relation relates everything to itself, because it doesn't exist. Right. Yeah. Right. But it's not only the well-typed programs that are related to themselves. There are some other programs that are also related to themselves. Those are also secure.
Right. So the definition of security ultimately is the semantic property of being self-related.
Exactly, yeah,
And so the relation is not reflexive, but the self-related things, that's what it needs to be secure. You could prove that directly about a term or use the type system, which is conservative, to complete the
Exactly.
type of.
exactly, yeah.
Thank you.
I had a few questions. My first question is really, really high level. So, what can we do now? What do you want to do with this?
It's,
So you have this,
mhm,
a type system for, recursive session types
mhm,
that have guarantees of sound information flow.
mhm.
What kind of, and like, what's cool is it seems like we now have a strong guarantee about what that type system can tell us.
Right,
So what programs do you want to subject to this new type discipline?
you mean in a practical setting, or?
Sure, I mean, everyone's practical is different, but like, so we have this cool new type system that like proves a strong property. What program do you want to prove that property of?
Okay, so let me think about it a little bit. Okay, so first of all, without recursion, there are not lots of programs that you can run. Right?
Sure.
It's not very interesting.
And recursion is clearly the huge challenge here.
Right, but with recursion, we can write more programs, and the programs that we can write are, so everything that you can do here is Turing complete. So any program that you want to write, there is a way to write it here. But again, if you want to do it like in a practical way, there is a limitation because usually, like, for example, if I'm a bank, if I talk to Alice, if I receive something from Alice, I cannot talk to Bob anymore.
Right.
So I'm kind of useless. So that is why we have these authorization processes going back and forth so that we don't receive, the bank shouldn't receive anything from Alice.
This
So
was the core of my question earlier, because it seems like you said you're working on declassification, which feels
exactly, so
important for real stuff.
exactly. So it's either declassification or we need some kind of sharing,
Mhm.
meaning that if I talk to Alice, so Alice can, for example, acquire the bank, it can talk to me, and then we close the session, we forget about whatever happened, and now bank can be acquired by Bob, for example.
Right.
Again, so in a practical setting, I should say, well, like, we need one more step, which is either declassification or sharing. But yeah, you can write very cool programs with this. And I think the nice thing about this is really it seems like session information flow control is somehow married into this process, and message flow and message passing between processes, because you have this flow of information and you want to, for example, if you have a big server, you have lots of processes connected to each other, you want to make sure that the information that flows between them are secure. Did that answer your
For me, it
question?
totally makes sense. Good.
Yeah.
I have more questions, but I don't want to hog the floor for the people on. All right, I'll execute a pincer maneuver and now ask you a very, very low level question. What is the difference with the step indexes in normal, like operational semantics? I feel like the setup here is the same and that you have the same quantification. You're measuring something different, obviously.
Right. So in the pure functional setting, the step index is they're like, let's say that you're in an equirecursive setting.
Mhm.
They count the number of steps until they can evaluate.
You
Right.
give up when you hit your limit. Yeah.
Exactly, until you have like the end result.
Right.
And in the best case, they will count the number of unfoldings internally and externally until they get the end result. And this index would shows itself in the number of like this
Right.
internal steps here, which we don't have,
Mhm.
right? So our setting is more extensional. That is why I put extensional equivalence, because we don't care what happens inside. What we only care about the observations.
Mhm.
So in their setting, it makes sense because your end result is a value, and it makes sense to say like, evaluate like with this number of steps until you get to the value. In our setting, we somehow our index is the observations that, again, I told you that think about these channels as cells. Our observations, the number of times that the observer can open a cell and look at its value, look at what is going, like the message that is inside it.
Mhm.
So because we're in a very different setting, and the interesting part is, so our first try was to use actually that step index, and with that we cannot prove transitivity because as you can see, there is a for all here,
Mm.
and there is the exist here.
Mm,
So
mhm.
to be able to deal with higher order channels, we needed to bring this for all inside. We needed to like, bring this for all inside the exist, but it won't happen if there is like an, an instance of M here, it doesn't.
Right there, yeah, yeah.
So,
Interesting.
Nice, that's the flaw of so many steps in there. Seems very intentional, like these steps are quite artificial. It's some abstract transition system, like what would you have to do with another representation of the same semantics or
exactly, yes,
these are observations, so this assume extension.
right.
So relatedly, do you think you could, so first, would it be a fair summing up to say that what you've done is, whereas normal step indexing is literally counting steps in some very artificial low-level semantics, you've said, oh, no, those are all tau transitions. Here's the transitions I care about. It's really, we're doing step indexing up to these transitions.
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. So I'm glad I understood, right? So could you sort of flip it and say, okay, great, let's redo recursive logical relations for a normal language, but we're only going to show the transitions we care about. Would that work, or is that not going to work?
No, we tried it.
Wow, what a bummer.
Yeah, we tried it for a couple of months, and it's not possible. It's really like it shows the difference that they have in nature. One is the end result is a value, so you have to like
Right.
count the steps toward that value. One is like it's more like a bisimulation, so you have to. And it turned out that after we came up with the step index, it turned out that it really matches the like. It's a no-notion stratified by simulation. And it turned out that they're really match up. It's like the number of observations really.
Can you show us the details? So, I mean, here's M, the other side has n+1, but there's nothing where we're seeing M getting incremented, right? We're not seeing the n+1 defined in terms of the M related to.
She showed it for the value relation.
Right, so they go down in the value relation. So whenever you do some
Okay.
external, so whenever like these three subconfigurations want to pass a message between themselves, then there is an observation for it, because this is really the interface. So any message that comes through the interface, now there is an opportunity for the observer to look at. So we go one step down.
You can see also sort of the real difference with the standard step index logical relation model, because there the steps go down typically in the term relation when you're taking steps, and the value relation is sort of inert. But here, well, values, this is the moment you've done something at the boundary, and so this is where the step happens. And the term relation says, oh yeah, just keep running.
Exactly.
So it's a cool, it's a cool difference. It's kind of neat.
Yeah.
I have one last one, but I don't know. I'm just totally hogging the floor. I feel bad, everybody. No?
You're good.
Okay, great. What would it take to generalize to cycles in communication?
Oh, that's a good question.
We have this tree assumption.
Right, so we use this tree invariant a couple of times, but the most important thing is we somehow so when I define this tree variant here, the max secrecy and
Right.
everything, we somehow associate the maximal secrecy of a process to its offering channel.
Mhm.
And the reason is, well, in the intuitionistic setting, you can always identify a process with its with the unique thing that it offers. So the first step is to somehow bring this, somehow like put a maximal secrecy for P, not for the offering channel.
Mhm.
And but the other So that would be the type system and how to formalize that. But the other thing is, well, if we do have this cycle of things, we lose deadlock freedom.
Sure.
And so there should be a way to do that.
You already have non-terminations, so.
Right. So I'm not sure if you should then say, let's. Yeah, because in our proof, we relied on the fact that we have progress. There is no deadlock. So there might be a way to say, oh, if they are deadlock free, then this is the, you know, secure flow of information for,
Most secure program you can write,
yeah.
doesn't do anything.
Yeah, but that's the thing, yeah, because with non-termination, you also have this problem. If in one branch you get to a deadlock, in the other branch you don't, then there is itself is a leak. Because based on a secret, you get into some kind of deadlock and you cannot do the continuation.
Because it's by simulation, you're sort of inherently termination sensitive.
Right, yeah,
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um,
that would be a nice actually future board, but yeah.
I have one last one. Okay, so you gave this intuition up front, which is a nice intuition, though I think Phil Wilder would get mad if you gave it in front of him, just a fair warning. To think of these session types as, oh, well, it's just a bunch of inboxes, right? And outboxes of the state. So he of course gets mad whenever anybody suggests using shared state. I don't know how he runs his email or whatever. So my first thought when you gave it, was like, okay, right, that's an implementation strategy. And there's a bunch of static IFC for these settings. What guarantees do you get? So suppose I took this approach and said, well, I'm not going to write a distributed system with session types or whatever. I'm just going to write down a shared state program with these inboxes that's mutable state. I'm going to try to use static IFC to verify.
Right.
Are there programs it can do that you can't, or vice versa? How does that line up? Does that question make sense?
It makes sense. It's just that again, I think like with session types, we have a at least with binary session types, we know that. So first of all, I gave this intuition because I think it helps because like if that was a mistake that I did, you know, at some point I thought, oh, so this A is on the right, it's just the thing that you evaluate is very similar to functional settings. So it took me a time to understand like what is really the difference between session types and pure functional setting. So although we don't have sharing, we have some kind of sharing, but the sharing is very minimal. It's only between two processes. Right. So I wanted to like convey that thing. But so the nice thing about this kind of like minimal sharing is that we have session types that we could annotate our like logical relation with session types. So if you have any cell in the memory that is like a shared memory thing, then I'm not sure if you can make this like duality, because now it's shared between many things and there is no such duality, send, receive, anything between them, you know what I mean? So usually when
the types of static IFC, when you read or write to state, will be properly sort of recording that as a flow of information
right,
in one direction or another. So
Right.
I mean, it's not the same. I agree. You don't have session types are a great hook because you get to use them as the index for logical relation.
exactly, yeah.
But I just wondered. So suppose you took this program, does it induce a well-typed static IFC imperative program?
Oh,
And then also, so that's one direction, right? If it induced it, okay, cool. Like, I mean, that actually gives you sort of a verified compiler on some level where verification on both ends, it's kind of neat. But then also, I would imagine you get somehow different guarantees. Like the session types are an interesting invariant that's tracking a lot of information for you. Whereas in the pure static IFC stateful version, nobody's saying, and you're not allowed to write this, and you're not allowed to that, though a conformant program won't do that. So I wondered, well, what is the actual relationship here? So like, if you using this analogy of these are just a bunch of mutable references or queues or whatever, does static IFC reject the same programs, a subset, an overlapping random set of programs?
that's an interesting question. I have to think about it. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, but that's interesting, actually.
Okay, I'm done, sorry.
I mean, static systems are often pretty weak in what, as the type systems are pretty weak in what they can do, and if you're doing. More logic based where you do exactly try to impose, like, especially for concurrent information flow, you have rely guarantee conditions on what the threads can be doing to shared state, stuff like that.
Yeah.
To get enough precision to.
Yeah, so no, so
So
here I
you
would,
could conceivably think about, could you transport the invariants that are expressible by session types into that kind of shared memory sort of setting as convenient things to be specifying.
I think that was what Carl Mazarek's PhD was on. I think, I only kind of got what he did. So Carl Mazurek did a bunch of, I think he was at CMU before he came to Penn when I was there. He did a bunch of stuff with Frank and then later with Steve Stansiewicz on the relationship between linear logic and session types and concurrency.
Mhm,
So I think he was working on stuff related to that question, but not for information flow.
mhm.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dave. I think that like you're gonna get invariants out of the session types that they're not gonna be easily expressible and say like GIF or whatever.
Right, but it'd be interesting to see if that leads to ideas that could be used in other settings.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, I think we should wrap up. Maybe some of us can go to lunch. So thank you again.